entities, and kind of looking at kind of speculating on the future of our kind of society, essentially.
Charlotte, would you like to go next?
Yeah, unmute myself, and yes, I will then go. Perpetual Zoom issues. All right, hi everybody. I'm Charlotte. I'm a PhD student at Manchester Metropolitan University. I fall into the Gothic constantly by accident. I never mean to study the Gothic. I am always accidentally studying the Gothic in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, I also love Zoom with Teams as much as I hate Zooms and Teams. Yeah, very much. So in terms of my research, I'm looking at game narratives and specifically how non-human elements of games become actants in the narratives we tell in games. So specifically, I'm looking at artificial intelligence, I'm looking at procedural content generation and non-player characters, which is what my talk was on a little bit yesterday. But also I categorize game space just in general as its own non-human entity that then has those kind of effects on the narrative. The case studies I picked have been The Binding of Isaac, Bloodborne, and Death Stranding, and all of them I think come in some way, in shape or form, through the Gothic. Whether or not you entirely agree, for example, that Death Stranding is Gothic, I will argue and die on that hill, but maybe we can get to that. But yeah, I think the Gothic is a really interesting, in my research, a part of understanding how non-human actants can get involved, are always perpetually changing or altering how narratives kind of are perceived by players, readers, audience members, etc. Yes, I will be quiet about myself and move on to the next person.
That was great, thank you so much. And then Iris, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sorry, it seems to be that my camera is just cut out. I just switch it off and switch it on again, and hopefully it's gonna do the thing.
That looks okay on my side.
Can you see me? Because I can't see anything, but okay.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. I don't have to see myself. Okay. Well, I'm Iris Kleinecke-Bates. I'm a lecturer at the University of Hull. As I said yesterday in the talk, I've never done anything on games before. I enjoy playing them, but really that was more something that I sort of do in my private time. But it started to sort of feature more and more into what I'm doing. I lecture in television studies mainly. My background is sort of film studies, and the thing that I'm always seem to be drawn to is sort of discourses around memory and nostalgia on the one hand, and then materiality studies. So very often, and this is something that really started with my own PhD work, where I was looking at representations of Victorianism. I always seem to sort of veer towards looking at rooms and objects and sort of symbolic significance. So this is something that's continued, and I've worked on just representations of the past, representations of history and nostalgia in other kind of aspects of television before. Kind of I was looking at televisions themselves and technology for a while, and then also sort of 1950s, 60s with Mad Men. And most recently, I think in a sort of a rather morbid way of dealing with COVID, I've started thinking more about the post-apocalypse. And during the whole those COVID years, I started sort of reading loads and loads of post-apocalypse narratives. And so my current research project really developed out of that. I've never framed it in relation to the Gothic before, which has sort of surprised me a little bit when I thought about it after I was asked to take part in this roundtable, because of course they are all Gothic spaces, very, very literally Gothic spaces in what they represent, in their kind of symbolic meaning, in the way they kind of, you know, in the way they sort of represent people that are not there anymore, you know. I mean, they're literally sort of about death. So you know, I mean, you can't really get much more Gothic than that. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sort of hearing what other people have to say, and hopefully also contributing. So we'll see. Thank you for inviting me to this.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for being here. So I guess, like, just to start us off with, is we set this up just because with a lot of our previous conferences, we've had feedback just to say that we would like more interaction between speakers and also audiences. So yeah, it's like what Steph said, you know, feel free to drop any questions in the chat. But yeah, I was hoping to get an idea of what you thought about the conference. Did you manage to see many other speakers? And what kind of stood out to you? That's open to either of you. If anyone wants to jump in.
I don't mind, because I'm actually really happy, especially that obviously that Charlotte and Iris are here, because being a Gothic scholar, it was really interesting to me to kind of see their works, especially Charlotte's, I think, started off the conference. And Iris's as well in particular. I don't know if it was just because I got really enthusiastic about a paper that looked at Horizon Zero Dawn, a game that I'm terrible at, but the ideas and implications of looking at objects in memory and nostalgia in the game's essentially post-apocalyptic worlds as time capsules, it was fascinating to me a little bit, and a bit of a contrast, because my work, even though that is very rooted in the Gothic, which is of course traditionally associated with the 1800s, I have futuristic views of that. So I look at kind of all of the tensions in Gothic, particularly between the body borders of monsters, and I look at all of the kind of the ways that normative expectations are being shattered, and then I put my own futuristic theory in there about what I expect to emerge. So it was really interesting to me to see different Gothic approaches, which were kind of linked to my work a little bit, but completely twisted and threw everything on its head. And I also really love the keynote speaker, Daniel's work. Is a very thorough overview on space and place, and I took away so much from that, given that I specialize in body horror. So that was just a fantastic talk for me.
Yeah, I will agree. I really had a lot of fun yesterday. I will say I'm a little unwell, so I've been on Lemsip for the last few days. So also my conference has been affected by some probably feverish feelings from the Lemsip. But I will agree. I really enjoyed especially the first three papers because they were so nicely entwined with the Gothic. And it's just lovely to see the range that Gothic studies can take, because as you were saying, Steph, it can be often pitted as something that came out of like the Castle of Otranto and stuff like that in like 1764 or whatever that was when that was really published, and then from there and it's got sometimes a very Victorian kind of look and feel, but realistically the Gothic has changed so much, and you can really see it in the way that people are engaging with it from completely different places. Like I accidentally stumbled into it, Iris, as you're saying, you know, it's not something that's occurred to you maybe necessarily before, but I mean, as you were reading out what you've done previously in your career with the representations of nostalgia and stuff like that, I'm just seeing it like really being threaded straight through. So it's just lovely to see it, and it's been a really good conference. So thank you guys very much for organising it.
I can only echo really what both Steph and Charlotte have said. I've really enjoyed it. I've not been able to listen to many of the papers in the afternoon. I caught the keynote, but after that I had to log off. So I'm hoping to catch up with the rest of the papers when they're all uploaded. But I really enjoyed the morning, and I wasn't familiar with all the games that were discussed, but I really liked, and for example Charlotte's paper, I really liked that I was able to sort of see what was happening, because not having played that game before, it was really important, I think, you know, that you're able to kind of visualize what's happening, especially as you're sort of talking about, you know, game space as character itself. And that really resonated with me, in particular that, you know, that sort of idea that settings can be characters, because I think that actually is something that very much applies to the games I was looking at as well. Because really those kind of spaces in any kind of post-apocalypse game, they quite literally take the place of the absent people. You know, those stories of those people, the experiences of those people are locked up in what remains in terms of the kind of material objects that remain there. So really it is almost sort of a transformation of a human presence into an object presence. So that kind of really resonated. So I really liked that. And yeah, it's just really nice also to just listen to work in a field that I hadn't really considered academically before. And even though I enjoy the games, because it's not something that I normally work on, I have sort of quite limited knowledge in a way of what's actually going on there academically. So I've really, really enjoyed it. And I'm really hoping to you know, catch up on the rest of the papers that were given yesterday as well.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, we are really lucky that one of our members, Callum, is working really hard and going through the papers. So they should hopefully be up very soon. But no, I'm glad that you enjoyed the event. The morning really stood out to me. I think it really flowed very well between like the three of you, even though it's very different topics. It really surprised me how well they linked in. You know, I put them together for a reason, but I wasn't expecting them to sort of have as many like threads throughout, which worked as well. But yeah, Charlotte, your video was incredible. I absolutely loved it and would love to sort of copy that in future. And Steph raises like a good question is, should we be using more video essays and streams to sort of teach or talk about video game studies? So yeah, it'd be nice to see what you thought on that.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I mean, it's something that games are a very visual media, obviously. I mean, film is and stuff like that, but we don't normally do film playthroughs and pauses and, you know, conversations and those kind of senses. But I think games are a really interesting medium, which, as I say, if you don't know the game, if you're not aware of Bloodborne, you're not going to know what it looks like, what it plays like, what it feels like, anything like that. And although a video essay can't exactly get across how it feels like to have the control in your hands and play it, like you can't, I don't think that's necessarily ever going to be put across unless you physically get people to sit down and play the game at the same time, which could be quite funny actually. But it's not always going to be the easiest thing to do, a video essay. They definitely take a lot more time pre the conference to organize and set up. I am very fortunate that behind me, you can barely see it, but my partner's got a really good computer, so I can spend the time on that rather than my tiny little terrible laptop to edit a video and put it together and add the audio on and do all those kind of elements, and then download it, send it through, put it on YouTube and all those kind of elements and things. There is quite a lot of effort to put in pre a conference, but I do think that there are definitely a lot of pros that come across with that particular way of deciding to present. I've only done it twice, but it's something that I'm thinking in the future I might continue with doing, as I'm hearing positive things about it anyway. So.
Yeah, no, I loved it. I found it was it did really help. Like it wasn't the same as like experiencing place in a video game, like when Iris was talking about The Last of Us, because I played that and I loved it. I was like, oh yeah, I get these connections. So it wasn't exactly the same, but it did really help because I've never played Bloodborne, but it did make me also want to play Bloodborne. Yeah, yesterday definitely added to my to-do list of games to play. But yeah, Iris, did you have something that you wanted to jump in and say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Actually, I want to play Bloodborne now as well. But yeah, I think I wanted to kind of respond to the point that Charlotte was making about the technology, because I think that would be my big hindrance. In a television conference, I usually show a clip because that is quite easy to do. But I wouldn't have quite known how to set that up with the game, because I just about managed to figure out how to do screen grabs on the PlayStation, but I'm not quite sure how I would go about recording myself. So I think that, I mean, fortunately, I think what I was talking about, it sort of kind of worked with just the stills, because I was kind of, they kind of worked as examples. But if it was something that was more to do with with interaction, I think that's something that I would have to somehow figure out, and I think it definitely works really, really well, and it's useful. But yeah, I think that's something that is much easier in the context of film or television than in terms of gameplay. Also because you have to really be quite forward thinking. So while I was playing these games, I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh yeah, I might need that scene. So what do I do then? You know, how do you go back? Do you have to play the whole thing again to actually then capture that particular moment? I'm guessing yes. So I think it's actually quite tricky to do. I'll have to stop for a moment. My dog is doing something unmentionable in the background. I don't know if you can hear that sort of banging and scraping sound. I don't know what he's doing. So I'll be back in a second.
That's okay.
That sounds like a very funny, terribly naughty dog.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pop in and say, yes, you do need to, if you missed it the first time, go back through and play the game again and catch it. So usually I have a long, with the I have a PlayStation 5, there's a share button on there and it can hold like about 30 minutes worth of footage. So I could go like 30 minutes at a time if that's something that I really want to make sure I capture absolutely everything. But there's a reason why you didn't see any boss fights in that game, and it's because one, I can't control the camera very nicely with a boss fight. It ends up going all over the place and it will make people feel incredibly sick to watch it, unfortunately. And I didn't want to fail on camera too many times also. And a lot of the bosses I'd already done on that playthrough, and I didn't want to have to go and start a whole new playthrough again to hit them again. So that's a particular reason why. But Ewan, that sounds awesome that you plug a PS2 into a VHS recorder. I had not even thought of doing that. That's absolutely awesome.
No, yeah, that does sound like a really good idea. I didn't even know you could plug PlayStations into VHS recorders, but like Steph, I genuinely can't get my PlayStation 2 to work either. So sadly, we're just both PlayStation 2less. But no, that's great. It's been so nice to hear about how you make your videos and things. That actually leads us on quite nicely onto one of my next questions. So what was like the process of creating your papers, and what advice would you give to early career academics? That's open to anyone who's wanting to take it.
Well, my paper changed a little bit because it was supposed to be slightly more cyberpunk based, but as I was making it, I decided to take a bit of a broader look. In a way, I've got quite an easy job when I present anything specifically on kind of biopunk, which is very gothic in the sense that it deals with body horror and tension, just because there are so few scholars at the minute specifically focused on that we're still at the definition stage, which means that in a nice way, I get to construct whatever I kind of want out of existing Gothic and post-humanist literature to basically, it's almost like I'm writing a chapter 1 of the book each time rather than into the like chapter 5 or 6, which is a bit more technically detailed. So it was quite nice for me. But at the same time, it was a massive overview to kind of see that I hadn't kind of slipped on any banana skins and that I hadn't overlooked anything to deal with, in particular incorporating ludology a bit more, because I am very much a narratologist. But if I'm talking about making a game and how do we make that structure, I have to consult with games developers to do that. And I did talk to quite a few games developers while making the paper, and it was quite eye-opening for me. And while it wasn't featured in the paper, what I have been experimenting with in the last 2 months or so is building my own video game, which is the first time I've ever done that, but it's just to give me a little bit more insight into the process of how you start to conceptualize and plan what you want a game to be. And that was a really interesting thing for me. Maybe I'll bring it more into future papers, but it was just something that really solidified my knowledge a little bit.
Can I just say, Steph, that sounds absolutely amazing. What an amazing project. That'd be really interesting to see, actually, when, you know, presumably you're going to work with that once you've done that. You're going to probably, you know, structure some work around that, I'm guessing.
Yeah, honestly, it was horrific because I consulted a games developer friend and basically got all of the software downloaded, started, made very good inroads, and then my laptop that I was building everything on completely died and I had no backups or anything. So I am starting from scratch again. But it's been stressful, but it's been a great lesson in actually games development itself and just technology and everything going wrong, which it does. I'm enjoying the challenge. I think after this month in particular, because I have quite a lot of deadlines, it's something that I really want to focus on for the next 6-7 months. Just even if I don't specifically produce a thing, just so that I know the mechanics involved, and that I just get a little bit more understanding of this thing that I'm criticizing all the time. It just makes me feel a bit more confident that I'm not always annoying my colleague Adam Jarrett at Portsmouth University, who makes games and is always screaming at me to play them more before I write a paper. So I'm doing it for him, really.
I think that's sort of I'm finding that, that I'm lacking that kind of background completely, obviously, because I know literally nothing about programming. And I think it's really important, that part, isn't it? Because it's sort of, you don't know actually the sort of the challenges of how these things actually have to come together in terms of that aspect, because that's the bit that's so different to other visual media, isn't it? That sort of interactivity. I was wondering, I just kind of wanted to ask you, since we're talking now, when you say, I mean, you're kind of more, you're sort of looking at body horror and so on. I was sort of wondering, how do, because there's obviously a fair amount of stuff on body horror in relation to cinema, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know much about it, but I know there is. But how does that intersect with work on computer games? How do the two come together? Is that sort of transferable or not?
No, to an extent there is, especially when you're looking at kind of the narratives. I mean, you can take anything. I'm a huge fan of the work of Sarah Wasson, who kind of often looks at the commodification of bodies and will then apply that to a text or a film. And I quite like that process in doing that myself. But there is kind of an interesting area where the idea of interactivity with the player and how the player is transformed through play, and also the different mechanisms that we get, for instance, how we can transform a character, how we can level them up specifically in a way that we can't possibly ever do in life, how an avatar is never static and we can mold them and make them ours, and the implications that has for body transformation. So there is a lot of crossover, but sometimes game mechanics just give a little bit more that we can kind of play with that we couldn't necessarily do with other mediums. That there is crossover, but there's just some unique features what haven't really been dug into a huge amount through a Gothic and post-humanist lens. They've been talked about in terms of ludology, but there's not always been kind of the other crossovers with the different disciplines, which is why I like to take a multidisciplinary approach and look at things hopefully in a slightly new and often very weird way.
Yeah, can I imagine, because a lot of the work on horror studies in relation to film and television is really sort of based on gaze theory to some extent, isn't it? It's about looking, and of course games are not just about looking. It's the doing bit that really is what makes them so different, isn't it? So yeah, I was just kind of I'm just intrigued how that would translate, because a lot of these arguments are really based on the idea of looking at this stuff rather than actually interacting with it in any way. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's that contrast between almost the Gothic spectacle and what we go back to, and also inhabiting a body. And there's also arguments, of course, for if you're inhabiting a body, which sometimes in body transformation, body horror often means a disabled person. Are we cosplaying as disabled people through those games when we are an avatar? For instance, I talked about Cyberpunk in my paper a little bit, one of the only video games that specifically disables a character so that they experience chronic conditions where your avatar cannot function in that world for certain periods of time. And is that a great educational tool where we get disabled representation? Does it get into the area of almost cosplaying a disability though? And I think that's a really interesting kind of area of discussion. I hope that is hopefully going to emerge in game studies in the coming kind of months and years.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. I think we're kind of hogging it, aren't we? So I'm gonna hand back because I don't know, and I'll hog the discussion. But yeah, thank you for answering that, because I'm really interested in that.
Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for having that little discussion there. I guess we've kind of like touched on it a bit. So you've been talking, like Steph's been talking about, definitely like taking interdisciplinary approaches. And Charlotte, you said that you kind of accidentally fall into the Gothic. Do you see yourself as more of a like a video games researcher, or do you see yourself as like a spatial researcher in video games, or do you kind of take an interdisciplinary approach? So yeah, what's your inspirations basically?
Well, in all of my funding applications, it's an interdisciplinary approach, because that is accordingly what you're supposed to be putting down on funding applications these days.
That's the buzzword.
It is indeed the buzzword, along with a lot of other ones as well. But I am interdisciplinary. I think that is what I would categorize myself as. I have a complicated thing, because I work with, in some ways, with artificial intelligence kind of elements of things, with coding and those kind of parts. The crossover between arts and humanities and STEM subjects can sometimes feel like an actual cavern, like an actual ravine, I mean, with no way of crossing, and trying to have conversations in all the spaces. It can be very, very difficult. Initially, though, I'm from an English literature background, and I suppose that would be where I'd categorize my home, with narratology. It's the same with Steph there as well. And so I always feel like I'm a literature student masquerading with different masks that are put on every day, and try and get people to agree to my literary narratological ideas, essentially put them in like vegetables in kids' foods, basically.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think I've found like very similar things, especially like when my PhD funding applications, is that they want a lot of like interdisciplinary approaches. Like that's the buzzword at the minute. But I think video game studies and generally, like a lot of my area of research is looking at non-media centric media studies, and it is taking like different disciplines and looking at them in a different context. So like with spatial things, we might look at a lot of things in geography, like we had talkers talking about phenomenological geography and things. So I think it is, video game studies is a very interdisciplinary area of academia at the minute, especially because it's quite new. We don't have a lot of video games researchers who are solely video games researchers. But yeah, so Iris, what kind of inspired you to dabble in video games research, I suppose, and what kind of influences have you had based on your previous research specialisms?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I kind of, and we all like to research and write about what we enjoy, don't we? And gaming is something that sort of always played a little bit of a part in my life. I'm not terribly good at it. So I tend to need help. I remember Steph was saying earlier she was terrible at Horizon. So am I. I have finished it, but I admit I had help from my kids. So I think that's probably some of the limitations that I have in sort of breaking more fully into that field, is my own limited ability in that area, because I don't think my reflexes are fantastic. So I tend to sort of, freeze and panic and, and then die. So that's a real problem that I have. I enjoy working on it. And I've never felt that disciplines work very well just when they become islands, and of course they all there's so much kind of interactivity that you get now. I mean, for example, I remember the kind of interactivity that television offers now. I'm not saying that it's really comparable to that of games, but there is a sort of a push for more interactive elements within different forms of media, I think. And I think it doesn't really work, because nothing sort of stays fixed. I mean, there are voices, there are people who are saying that television is dead, that television as it used to be is a thing of the past. And I think there is an argument to be made there, that with all the different streaming platforms and so on, that actually the old sort of terrestrial television is something that is sort of dying a slow death to some extent. And I think you kind of can't stand still, can you? And sort of just sort of barricade yourself within a discipline. I mean, it's just like Charlotte said, she started out in literature. I mean, so did I. I started out in kind of English comparative literature, then moved into film studies. Then from there, almost accidentally moved into television studies. It's not that I even watch television that much. It's just that I found television interesting because it is so intertwined with our everyday life, and I'm quite interested in domesticity, in kind of things, how things intertwine with our everyday lives and our kind of domestic surroundings. And of course gaming does something quite similar in that it's something people do at home largely. So it doesn't have the same, when you go to the cinema, there's an element of extraordinariness about that. And of course you can watch films at home, but really they're meant to be watched in the cinema. That's what they're made for. So there is an element of kind of spectacle there, I think, which television doesn't really have to that extent. And I think gaming kind of interweaves with everyday lives in a very similar way, that people live with it. And of course a lot of these kind of big narrative games like Horizon or The Last of Us, they play out like television series. It's no accident that so many are actually becoming television series, because really they are already, aren't they? In terms of the narrative they offer, they split very easily into just episodes. It's just that you play them, you make it happen, rather than it just sort of happening despite you. But there's so many overlaps. So I think in a way it's a natural step, just hindered by my own, sort of rubbishness at actually gaming, I guess.
No, I completely understand that. There's so many games that I love, like the Mass Effect trilogy and Cyberpunk that I'm playing at the minute, that I would be absolutely lost with if I didn't have Steph telling me what to do. So yeah, I think it's quite an interesting point really about accessibility to becoming a video games researcher. It's not just the skills, but it's also like financial. Games are expensive.
I was about to come in and say that the financial burden of being a video game researcher is really real. I'm incredibly fortunate to be AHRC funded. However, they won't fund. They would not fund me to have a PS5, for example, or a nice PC, or the games that I'm even like just the media, like going to having the gumption, I suppose, to go to a funding body and be like, hey, I need these games to study. I need I would love a VR set to work in space in terms of in that, because I think that a lot of research into the Gothic and space should lean maybe towards the kind of horror games that are also going on in VR headsets. Well, that's what I'd like to do, but the financial burden of that, and I'm a funded student, so it feels like there is a clamp on. And I agree. Yeah, Ewan, getting games for teaching is also absolutely a struggle. I've been working with some people at MMU to try and organise for the games, getting like a set of games. We managed to get an Xbox, which is exciting. So, but that's about as much as we could do.
I agree with that, Charlotte. That really is a problem, isn't it? And definitely also for the classroom. I think another issue is time, because these games are long. So, and even longer if you're not very good at them, because everything takes endless amounts of time. And I think that is a real hindrance to developing any kind of breadth of knowledge. Because, what I've played is really quite limited, simply because I can't invest, sort of 50 hours into something that I might be working on at some point. So it's a real issue, I think, because on the one hand, it's wonderful that they're so long. And I love that about the types of games I like to engage in. But it makes it very difficult to sort of build up knowledge, I think, and kind of get that idea that you really have come to grips with that field.
Yeah, absolutely. And it changes how you pick games for courses as well, because you don't want to be giving people 100-hour long RPGs to be playing for something. It does mean that I think the canon, or I suppose the texts that are chosen are very much picked in specific ways. Ewan, in terms of how to stop controllers from going walkabouts, I just stare at the students and count them in as they go away, because it's done in a workshop style thing. But it does make me feel like a prison guard sometimes, like just making sure that these controllers don't disappear, because I couldn't afford to replace them, and I don't know how the university would be if we were like, well, the students just nick something. But yeah.
No, yeah, it's definitely something that I would struggle with. But yeah, so I guess I'll move the conversation maybe back a bit towards like the Gothic, even though I am really enjoying our discussion at the moment. But I'm just aware that Iris needs to head off soon, and we'll be probably closing up about then as well. So if we're talking about the Gothic, usually it refers to sort of 18th, 19th century like literature and architecture, things like that. What kind of features have you found in games that makes it Gothic? What kind of features are you looking for in games in terms of the Gothic?
I could start if that helps. For me, I mean, I think the Gothic as a whole is a spatial mode, and specifically a mode rather than a genre. So what I'm looking for is both, not necessarily like, I'm not like looking for stereotypical spaces. I'm not like, right, okay, well, that has a forest, that has a castle, that has like a haunted house. Like, there we go, it's Gothic. I mean, that could help towards identifying the Gothic, but for me, it's mostly about the how it affects how the player feels in a lot of cases, like that kind of affective response that you get to something that's Gothic, and those particularly can be quite spatial. So a feeling of claustrophobia or a feeling of disorientation are both something that's spatial in nature. It's about orientating yourself or having a response to the cramped conditions that you are in. And for me, that's something that can come up in games quite well and quite often. Resident Evil, why can you not leave the manor? Well, there's nothing outside the manor, but also it's because it's Gothic and it's claustrophobic, and you are trapped there. When you're screaming at like horror films and stuff like that, like, why can't you leave the house? Like, why don't they just leave the haunted house? Well, it's also because you need to build up that claustrophobic feeling. But I think games are quite good at doing that, and that is what I look for when I'm looking at games to be considered as Gothic specifically.
I think as well, for me, all of that I absolutely completely agree with. I take the Gothic a little bit more in a specific direction just in my own work, which is purely on body horror essentially, and the transformation. So all of those components that Charlotte talked about are incredibly important for establishing the Gothic. For me, I almost link the classic ideas of body horror through the Gothic, which if you talk about the most famous texts, generally tend to be Frankenstein, which is the reanimation of corpses, and Jekyll and Hyde, which is the transformation of a person into their, essentially what would be termed their shadow self, through taking a potion which transforms them, and you get to see almost split personalities essentially. So how does that manifest in kind of a neo-Gothic or a modern setting? Generally, that tends to happen through interventions of biotechnology and the audience's biological or bio-anxiety towards that. So the audience reacting or feeling suspense, that tension, almost that claustrophobia, but specifically in relating to the transformation of bodies in somewhere. There is often hierarchical structures, but whereas the doctor or the medical professional is not seen necessarily as caring, but at odds with the person in their humanity, and enforcing its strict control, the player themselves can become that, almost becoming the doctor over this unnamed creature, which is your avatar, your character, and controlling the direction of their life, and the avatar itself having no say and just being a representation of you and your desires. So there is a lot. I focus more on kind of the specific body, but it's always about that essential creeping tension and the gradual loss of control, and that somehow being at conflict with our identity is kind of broadly how I would see my work aligning into Charlotte's very good, definition of the Gothic and how my bodywork fits in a space, essentially.
I can't really add much to that. I agree with everything that's been said pretty much. I think it's important to actually kind of not think about the Gothic as this thing that has to play out in this sort of traditional setting, you know, castle ruins and so on. It can do, obviously, and then you recognize it very easily, don't you? But I think it can be any setting. I was wondering actually, Charlotte, Steph, considering the, you know, your sort of link with body horror and that whole idea of sort of, transform humans in a way. Have you looked at Soma at all?
I haven't. It is pretty much on my list. At the minute, I have generally, so my work specifically focuses on Mass Effect because there's every type of mutant under the sun. There's genetic engineering constantly, whether consensual or not. There's sterilization. I have from that looked more at kind of cyberpunk as the study of a werewolf, essentially, of a mutant emotion and the avatar not having control. And I've looked a little bit at film, such as the Gothic films of Luca. There is, though, quite a rise in particular video games that are getting into Gothic, and I like to explore a little bit some of the lesser known titles in the indies, but it's just, I will get there eventually. But yeah, Soma's a great shout.
Yeah, and it's just, you know, when you were talking about cyborgs, and then combined with what Charlotte was saying about it being an emotional response to a space, I just kind of, it really, I was just thinking, oh, it's like Soma. It's like Soma. I tried to play Soma on my laptop. I can't play it, unfortunately, because it makes me horrifically sick. Because it's first person, and I get motion sick with it. So I was sort of trying to play it in sort of 5-minute stints, and then just lying back, you know, with the flannel over my head, and then you know, playing a little bit again. So I can't actually finish it. But it kind of seemed to just combine all of that together. You know, it's just kind of, that's why I was wondering if you'd looked at it at all, because it's obviously, it has these sort of spaces which are, it's under the sea, and it is not at all a sort of classic Gothic space, but it is absolutely a Gothic space. And it's really that the tension in that game, I mean, it's classified as a horror game, isn't it? But it's not traditionally horror, I'd say, because most of it's sort of psychological, because you don't know what's going on. So you feel constantly like there's something sort of waiting. You know, you feel that sort of oppressive kind of claustrophobia all the time. And of course, the main character, it turns out to be a sort of type of cyborg, doesn't it? So yeah, so it's just kind of, you know, this is not really leading us anywhere. It's just an observation when I was listening, because really I have nothing useful to add to it, because I think it's everything that, you know, I would have said it's already been mentioned. I completely agree with both of you in relation to that.
I think the best thing about being a video games kind of scholar or researcher in any shape or form is that we always get good game recommendations off each other.
Sorry, yeah, I got a message about work and it distracted me. But no, yeah, so great. So yeah, another point that I wanted to sort of explore is so Emma Catan, who's the Victorian Legacies podcast host, has talked about how we're in a bit of a neo or modern Gothic era. So given the popularity of horror games and things at the moment, and over the past, like, what, 20 years, probably longer, do you see that changing in the future? Or do you think we'll see like a new type of Gothic where it's, you know, maybe a bit less like, Charlotte, you were saying, like Resident Evil, you're trapped in a big mansion scary thing, to like a newer versions of Gothic? If anyone wants to drop in with anything.
I don't know. I'll start, and then other people can pick it up and actually add much more detail, because obviously I don't really know that many games, but it seems to me that the games sort of, the medium itself I can't really think of a more perfect medium for anything horror related, because that kind of, nothing else can offer that experience of actually living it, of actually, you know, feeling it happen. So that kind of whole, the kind of game mechanics involved in that, I think it can do things emotionally, psychologically to the person playing that a film or a television could never do. So I think it's definitely a growing thing. I think there's probably going to be much more of it. I'm an absolute coward when it comes to horror, so I don't know, you know, apart from that one game which I tried to play, Soma, I've not played anything in that context whatsoever, because I just don't dare, because I like to sleep. So but really, I mean, that already, you know, that I feel that way about it, I guess, you know, is the perfect recommendation for it, really, isn't it? Because I just know that it's going to affect me too much. But I just can't help thinking that it's probably going to be where the future of that genre is, I think.
I mean, from my work specifically, I do think that is correct. We're going to have kind of a proliferation. I think as well, looking at, I think of like games in recent times that would look at kind of the body horror from the ones that I've studied, to even games a few years ago, such as Vampire, where you're stumbling around the 1800s Victorian London and you're dependent on sucking the blood of rats or people to survive. And you have no healthcare system, you have nothing to save you. You just have to either make the choice, do you kill the rats or do you kill the people, essentially? And I think of all of these stories like A Plague Tale as well, or, you know, the Telltale's Walking Dead. There is going to keep being these games, because I think particularly in the West, where the games industry is very dominant and there's power concentrated around particular Canada, America, there is a lot of healthcare anxiety. We're seeing these great advances with biotechnology. Oh my God, we can implant pig hearts into people and we can make valves work and we can do organ transplants more quickly and easily than ever before. But the benefits of those healthcare advancements aren't really happening to people who can't afford to get GP appointments, who the waiting list is soaring even before the pandemic. In Canada, there was a very recent case of, the Canadian government would not grant a woman accessibility support that she needed for her care to make sure that she lived with chronic pain every day, but they did grant her the right to ask a doctor to euthanize her. And I think what we're seeing with body horror and why these games are going to keep going is because we're imagining near future worlds where almost this technology makes anything possible with our bodies, but actually we never get the chance to dream of that because we can't get secure and safe healthcare. And as long as there's that tension, that anxiety, which is going to be reflected in particular by games developers who are often incredibly underpaid, don't have access to healthcare or healthcare insurance in particular in America. And those tensions filter from creatives into work. So I do think we're going to see that in the next 10 years or so.
For me, I mean, it's hard to look with a crystal ball to see the future, but I do think that I mean, the Gothic is it's been here since the 17th century. Some might even say early modern period times. There's definitely been some Gothic texts, and I would probably agree. And it's going to be here for forever, because it's a, as I suppose linking as well from what Steph's saying, is kind of a reflection of a community's fears, worries and anxieties. And if we're talking about tech as well, there's always going to be quite a lot of anxieties to do with technology, which can definitely come out quite well in video games. I think the future for a lot of Gothic and a lot of Gothic innovation, if we're talking about how it's going to change and alter itself, is probably going to be found more in the indie space than it is probably going to be found in AAA, due to cost reasons and budgeting and AA's incessant need to swallow itself essentially and reproduce itself constantly, like eat its own corpse essentially, in some ways, if you're going to talk about it gothically. Well, and indie can do that, and indie does have, and what do we count as indie and what do we count as AAA, and the middle ground, you know, there's an argument to be had there. But indie games tend to have a smaller budget, smaller time frame. They have a much a wider scope for innovation, trying something new, and horror thrives on new things, essentially, in some ways. Horror and Gothic, it's coming from that kind of vein. So that I just wrote a little note and I was like, oh, VR maybe, because I spoke about that earlier as well. And there's a lot of companies that are pushing VR to be like the big new thing constantly, all the time. There's always new, like the new VR helmet is the new thing. And PSVR 2 is coming out at some point soon. And I think it is a space for a lot of innovation and a lot of new kind of Gothic stuff to come out of it. Absolutely, it's only good if you can stomach it 100%. And also, again, we've talked about it before, to link it back to things we've already discussed, there's a massive financial thing that comes from VR that only people who have got a decent income, a decent disposable income can afford in most cases. Sometimes they do have offers on them, but you know, we're going into a cost of living crisis, there's energy issues, there's also massive environmental stuff going on currently, and for a long while with the climate crisis. How VR is going to be handled in that kind of world now post 2020, I'm not sure really. So I would say, if I have my crystal ball, indie is the way in the future for innovations and stuff in the Gothic.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And like, yeah, just kind of like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I always find things like horror and, you know, sci-fi and Gothic things, they tend to be reflections of, you know, like panics that are happening now. So maybe we'll see even more horrifying stories based on you know, the horrifying times we're going through with everything with the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. And Steph, I know that's, especially like with the pandemic and things, that's something you focus on quite a bit, isn't it?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much of a shift away from those, because I do think there'll be body horror. I don't know how much developers will want to do pandemic stories specifically, because I think there is a point where even they want to escape it. But I think in the immediate aftermath, there probably won't be pandemic stories, but give it another 10 years. And if games are starting to focus more and more on pandemics and the lessons that weren't learned, I think that is probably the cycle that is going to happen, unfortunately.
No, that's great. Thank you. And then I guess to sort of start and wrap up, just kind of what advice would any of you give to early career academics, maybe people in the undergrads or masters, or even just like me starting their PhDs? What kind of advice would you give if they're wanting to explore video games or video games in sort of Gothic spaces, or even just get into conferences like this?
I think my kind of advice is, well, there's two things really. The first one, which I'm going to insist is the most important, is to make sure that the entire time that if you're doing a PhD in particular, if you're doing it, make sure that your time has a strict boundary and that you stick by it, because it's very easy to want to do all of the conferences, all of the publications. And yeah, there's going to be pressure on you to do that and to build your profile, but you need to make sure that you get through it in good mental health. I remember the first time when I started my PhD, within the first week, someone told me that they themselves had cried every single day of the first year. That is not what your experience should be. I think I've cried maybe once, and that was because of my own scheduling issues. And I'm like starting third year now. It should be a happy, fun experience, and you can only do that if you've got good support around you. As for getting into conferences and things, there are check out the academic networks that are around and going on, because they're often very friendly, very supportive. There will be people there who can mentor you or can ask questions. And just, if you have an idea, submit that abstract. You know, a lot of people think, oh, I can't do this, I'm not there yet, I'm not good enough. But actually you are, and you've got to you've got to start somewhere. And I think sometimes, particularly with video game scholarship, there are video game studies people around, but it hasn't had the support for universities. And I think sometimes early careers think, oh, I need to have done this for 20 years, establish a name and then do something. No, you can do it now. And that would my 2 bits of advice there.
I think I'd echo that. You know, if you want to do something, just go for it, really. You know, don't wait, don't think it's the wrong time. And definitely that kind of social aspect, because it's really, I think what's toughest about a PhD is really the social isolation that is that people very easily fall into, I think, because it's a long project, there's very little structure to it. Depending on whether you pick up teaching or not, there is actually there can be very little interaction sometimes, and that sort of, from what I've seen, that is very often what people find the hardest about it. I mean, you're capable of doing it academically, you know. I don't think there are many people who pick up a PhD project who are not capable of doing that, because you know by that point whether that is something that you can achieve and do well. So that's not really it. It's really about how you arrange, how you structure your own time in a way that allows your mental health to not suffer. So for that, conferences are not a bad thing. I mean, I've always sort of struggled personally with conferences, sort of less so these days, I guess, but because I don't really, I've never particularly enjoyed public speaking that much. So I've always been sort of vaguely terrified, but I think they are a really important thing for that kind of networking, for actually just making contact with people who are in the same field, who you can actually then collaborate with as well, because there's a really enjoyable sort of aspect of PhD work, to actually get to talk to people who have the same passion that you have for your topic and for your research area. So it's really that kind of finding opportunities to meet others. I have to say, I've actually enjoyed this. I was quite apprehensive about the format, you know, it being a conference online, because it's, you know, much as I've in the past sometimes struggled with in-person conferences, I think I kind of miss them, because I quite like to get back to sort of just meeting people face to face. But that said, it's worked really, really well, and I've really enjoyed the last 2 days. So, you know, at this point, since I have to log off in a minute as well, thank you so much for having me as well, because it's been wonderful. It's been really enjoyable. I think, whatever works for PhD students is something that is still actually very much applies when you're working as a lecturer, because you still, we are sort of quite solitary creatures sometimes, we sit in our offices and sort of work away on our own stuff. And it's important to get out there and actually talk to others about our work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It's been lovely having you at the conference and today as well. It's been a really nice few days. And then Charlotte, is there anything else you would like to add?
I'll make it quite brief. Though I came to the PhD in 2018, so I'm coming close to the end now. And I had a lot of people did a pandemic in the middle, which changed how conferences were for me absolutely completely, because it happened at in partway through my second year, so I'd done like a year and a half essentially at the PhD. And I was starting to do conferences and stuff on my first couple of chapters and do that kind of thing, and also doing papers on just stuff that I was interested in. So stuff I'd just like write a paper out and go and do that. The pandemic happened. I found it incredibly difficult. I didn't do a lot of online I attended a lot, but I didn't speak a lot. My tech at the time and my setup just wouldn't work. So it was a bit frustrating. My advice to PGRs, anybody thinking of doing a PhD, is that to echo really, is that conferences are conversations at the base level. They're about having a discussion with somebody. You are not, obviously you want your work to be as good as possible when you're presenting it, but also everything you're presenting is constantly always in a work in progress. So if somebody comes to you and has a conversation and maybe says something, well, hopefully they're not nasty, but like if they're having a conversation about maybe ways that you could take your research, things that you might want to read and stuff like that, then you can take that on board and then apply it and create your work, make your work better from that essentially. So my advice would be try and attend conferences as much as you can. Obviously, if you can't go and talk at them, then that's fine. Maybe you can just sit and listen to it. But make a decision about, although I'm saying go to as many conferences as you can, you kind of also need to make decisions about if you're going to in-person conferences, about your travel, about cost, how that, I keep bringing things back to cost, sorry, it's in my mind. But you need to kind of, I'm hoping that now post-pandemic online conferences such as Space Place and Virtual World can be a more normal thing, or at least an online component being there. I mean, although I didn't do a lot of talks during the pandemic, I attended a number, and there were talks that I would never have been able to attend at all. There was the narrative conference that was happening, usually happens in America, that I don't get to go to normally. I could attend that. And my worry is that as we move on, that those virtual conferences will disappear. That we'll forget that we can be accessible as academics, and hopefully, cross fingers, that's not the case. And I'm really happy that this conference has been virtual so that we can prove that that's not necessarily the case. But yeah, PGRs, sticking in with it, you can do it, and prioritise your mental health because you really need it by the time you get to the end.
No, that's great. Thank you all so much for attending today and yesterday. It has been lovely. And yeah, I think you're completely right with the conferences and things. Like, you know, this has just been nice, just having a chat about everyone's research and interest ideas. So thank you for coming along. And yeah, I think we'll end it there. Obviously, we have the Discord for people to join if they want to sort of continue the conversation outside of the Zoom meeting. Yeah, I'm always happy to have more chats about games. And yeah, I think that's everything. Steph, is there anything else that you think I should add or you think needs adding? Oh, our Gothic Conference, you can plug that.
Yeah, we've got the Gothic Conference that's coming up in October. We have a call for papers though that ends on Friday. So just if people want to get 300-word abstracts to us, networkmultiplayer@gmail.com for our conference at the end of October, all on Gothic games and disturbing play. But no, you've covered absolutely everything. I've dropped the Discord link if people want to join that to keep up to date with multiplayer. But no, and thank you, especially Lisa, because you've done everything perfectly and it's been brilliant and a lovely evening.
Thank you. So yeah, have a great evening and hopefully I'll see you at some other events for the rest of the week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.